Jerusalem, October 1187. The gates are open. Saladin's army is standing outside a city that has been in Christian hands for 88 years. Inside, the people who defended it are waiting. They are not waiting to find out if they lost. They already know that. They are waiting to find out what kind of man has just won. 88 years earlier, when the city fell the other way, mercy was not what Jerusalem remembered. The Crusaders, who took this city in 1099, did not negotiate. They did not offer ransom. The accounts that survived that day, written by the people who carried out the killing and who understood that what had happened required a language proportionate to it, described streets where the dead were stacked so high that the living had to move around them. The sacred precincts ran with blood. The city that 3 religions called holy was introduced to its new rulers through the oldest language of conquest. Now Saladin stands at the gate. He has spent 15 years building toward this moment. He has unified a fractured world, broken the most powerful crusader army in a generation, and arrived here with every military and moral justification a man of his era could possess. The world that produced him, the world of holy war and sacred obligation and the memory of 1099, expects one thing. He knows what it expects. The question is not whether he can give it what it wants. The question is whether he will. The question of what a man does with absolute power in a moment designed for revenge is not a question that belongs to the 12th century. It has been asked in every century since. It is being asked now. The reason Saladin's answer still matters, 800 years later, is not because he was a saint. It is because he was not, and he still chose the way he chose. To understand why, you have to go back to the world that built him. Chapter 1. The world that made the war. In the summer of 1099, an army of Western European knights, soldiers, and pilgrims climbed the walls of Jerusalem and took the city by force. They had marched from thousands of miles away. They had crossed mountains and deserts, lost more men to disease and starvation than to any enemy, and arrived at the walls of the holiest city in Christendom after 3 years of suffering that most of them had understood, from the beginning, as the price of something sacred. They believed God had called them there. They believed the city was theirs by divine right. They believed that what they were doing was not conquest but reclamation. What they did inside the walls when the fighting stopped was remembered by everyone who survived it and by every generation that came after. The killing lasted days. It was not strategic. It was not the controlled violence of an army securing a position. It was something older and harder to explain. The release of years of suffering and deprivation and religious intensity into a space that could not contain it. Jewish residents who had taken shelter in their synagogue died when the building was set on fire. Muslim residents who had retreated to the Al-Aqsa Mosque were killed there. The city that every faith called holy was introduced to its new rulers through what would become the defining memory of everything that followed. The city fell on the 15th of July, 1099. The Muslim world received the news with shock, and then with something worse than shock: silence. Not because it did not care, because it did not know what to do. And that inability, the gap between the magnitude of what had happened and the capacity to respond to it, tells you everything you need to understand about why it would take nearly a century for anyone to answer. The Muslim world of 1099 was not a world. It was a collection of competing interests wearing the same name. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad held religious authority that no one seriously disputed, and political power that almost everyone seriously ignored. The Caliph could issue proclamations, He could bestow titles and legitimacy on rulers who needed the appearance of divine sanction. What he could not do was raise an army, organize a campaign, or compel the fractious dynasties and warlords and ambitious generals who actually controlled the land to point themselves in the same direction. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate offered a different kind of authority, Shia rather than Sunni, claiming descent from the Prophet's daughter and a theological legitimacy that the Abbasids rejected entirely. The Fatimids and the Abbasids had been rivals for a century before the Crusaders arrived. They would continue to be rivals after. The existence of Jerusalem as a wound in the heart of the faith was, for both of them, less immediately pressing than the existence of each other. In Syria and northern Iraq, smaller dynasties and city-states and warlords operated according to the logic that has governed fragmented worlds since the beginning of recorded history. Survival first, alliance when useful, war when necessary. The idea of a unified response to a unified enemy was not impossible to imagine. It was simply impossible to organize. And so the Crusader states took root. 4 of them. Eventually, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the largest and most symbolically significant, the County of Tripoli along the Lebanese coast, the Principality of Antioch in what is now southern Turkey, the County of Edessa further east, the most exposed and the first to fall. Together they formed a thin line of European power along the eastern Mediterranean coast, outnumbered, far from home, dependent on supply lines that stretched back to Europe and on the divisions of their enemies to survive. They survived for nearly a century, not because the Crusader states were strong, because the Muslim world around them was not yet united enough to be stronger. This is the context that most people miss when they try to understand Saladin. They see the man, and they see Jerusalem, and they see the dramatic reversal of 1099, and they assume that what he did was the natural response to an obvious situation. It was not obvious. It had been obvious, in the sense of being necessary, for nearly 90 years. The reason it took that long was not lack of motivation. It was lack of structure. What the Muslim world needed was not more anger. It had anger. What it needed was someone who could convert anger into organization, religious obligation into military coordination, and the memory of 1099 into something that could actually move an army from one place to another in the same direction at the same time. That someone was being built, in the decades before Saladin arrived, by a man named Nur al-Din. Nur al-Din ruled from Damascus, and later from a larger Syrian territory that he spent his life assembling through war, negotiation, and the patient application of a governing vision that most of his contemporaries lacked. He was a serious man, pious in the way that the best rulers of his era were pious, not as performance, but as framework. A genuine belief that the obligation of the faith required concrete political action, not just prayer and proclamation. He built hospitals, he reformed courts, he brought a quality of administration to the territories he controlled that made them function in ways that inspired loyalty from people who had grown accustomed to being administered by men who thought of them primarily as resources. And he began, slowly and systematically, to use the language of jihad, not simply as a religious call, but as a political instrument. This distinction matters enormously. Jihad, as pure religious emotion, had existed since 1099. It had produced occasional outrage, occasional mobilization, occasional campaigns that went nowhere and faded. Nur al-Din understood that emotion without structure is weather, powerful but uncontrollable, and ultimately transient. What he built was structure that emotion could fill, a framework of religious obligation linked to specific military and political goals, directed at specific targets, coordinated through specific institutions. He made the reclamation of Jerusalem into a project rather than a prayer. He embedded it in the mosques he funded, the scholars he patronized, the inscriptions he commissioned for, the buildings he constructed. He made the memory of 1099 into architecture, into law, into the daily texture of governance, in a way that no amount of political upheaval could easily erase. He did not live to complete it. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Jerusalem was still in Crusader hands. The road he had been building ran to the edge of what one man's life could accomplish and stopped there. The city at the end of the road was still waiting, but the road existed, and there was a man standing on it. His name was not yet a legend. It was not yet the name that European chroniclers would write about with reluctant respect, that Dante would place among the virtuous pagans in the early 14th century, that Walter Scott would romanticize in novels read by people who had never heard of Nur al-Din or the Fatimids, or the specific texture of what it meant to grow up Kurdish in a world organized around Arab identity. He was 37 years old. He controlled Egypt. He was about to do something that no one, including the people who knew him best, had fully anticipated. He was about to decide that the road Nur al-Din built belonged to him now. Chapter 2. The Boy from Tikrit. He was born in Tikrit in 1137. On the same night, his family left. The timing is one of those details that later generations reach for when they want to find destiny in ordinary circumstances. Naim al-Din Ayyub, his father, had been the governor of Tikrit. On the night his son was born, something went wrong. An altercation, a death, a political miscalculation. Accounts vary, and the family was forced to leave the city before morning. The baby who would one day take Jerusalem was carried out of his birthplace in the dark before he had been in it long enough to remember anything about it. Later writers loved this detail. The man with no fixed home from his very first night. The outsider from the beginning. The truth is more ordinary and more interesting. Najm al-Din Ayyub was a practical man in the best sense of that word. He understood the world he was operating in. A world of shifting alliances and powerful patrons and opportunities that opened and closed faster than most people could track them. And he navigated it with a consistency of judgment that provided his family not with wealth or stability in any permanent sense, but with survival and, eventually, proximity to power. The family settled in Baalbek, then moved to Damascus. Following the gravity of Zengid patronage northward as Nur al-Din consolidated his position in Syria, Ayyub served Nur al-Din directly and served him well. He was rewarded with position and trust, the currencies that mattered most in a world where physical wealth could be confiscated and titles could be revoked. But a reputation for reliable service was harder to take away. Saladin grew up inside this world. Damascus in the 1140s and 50s was a city of real intellectual and cultural life, a place where the scholarship of the Islamic world moved through markets and mosques, and the courts of men who understood that learning and power were not separate things. He was educated in the traditional curriculum: theology, jurisprudence, the Arabic language and its literature, the history of the faith and the obligations it placed on those who held it seriously. Later writers, reaching back to construct the origin story of a legend, remembered him as a young man more drawn to study and religion than to the glamour of military life. Whether that memory is exact or has been polished by the needs of later storytelling is impossible to know with certainty. What it reveals, whatever its accuracy, is how the people who came after him wanted to understand him, not as a man born hungry for conquest, as someone pulled into history by forces larger than his own ambition, a student who became a soldier because the times required it. The truth, again, is more complicated. He was Kurdish, in a world that organized its political and religious identity primarily around Arab lineage. This was not a catastrophic disadvantage. Kurdish soldiers and administrators served throughout the Zengid and Abbasid systems, and competence was a currency that crossed ethnic lines when powerful men needed capable subordinates. But it was a background, a thing that certain people in certain rooms would always see before they saw anything else. A fact about him that no accomplishment could fully erase from the minds of those for whom it mattered. He learned to operate in that awareness, the way people learn to operate in any condition they cannot change. Not by pretending it did not exist, by becoming so clearly valuable that the people with the power to define him had more practical reason to overlook it than to dwell on it. The man most directly responsible for pulling him into the world of serious power was not his father, but his father's brother. Shirkuh was a different kind of man entirely. Where Ayub was measured and careful, Shirkuh was physical, direct, and possessed of the specific quality that makes certain military men magnetic, even to people who would never choose to live the way they do. He loved fighting in the way that some people love music or mathematics, not as a means to an end, but as the thing itself, the problem to be solved, the language he was most fluent in. He was short and broad, and walked into rooms as though he expected them to get out of his way. Which, often enough, they did. Shirkuh saw something in his nephew that the polite description of a studious young man does not fully capture. He saw someone who observed carefully, who understood people, who had his father's practical intelligence, but applied it to situations faster and at larger scale. He began including Saladin in his campaigns, his negotiations, his presence at the courts of powerful men. What Shirkuh was giving him was not military training in the narrow sense. It was an education in how power actually moved, not through proclamations, through the management of men who could deliver outcomes, through the ability to read a situation quickly enough to position yourself in it before it became something else. Through the discipline of choosing, in any given moment, between what you felt and what the situation required, and consistently choosing the situation. Saladin was a good student. By the time Nur al-Din began to send Shirkuh on the mission that would change everything, Saladin was in his mid-20s. He had served. He had observed. He had developed. In the years of his formation, a quality that the later record makes clear, but rarely names directly. He knew how to wait, not passively, not with the resignation of a man who has accepted that he cannot move, with the particular attention of a man who understands that the right moment and the wrong moment are not always obvious in advance, and that the cost of moving too early is often higher than the cost of waiting one more day. He would need that quality in Egypt. He did not know yet how much. Chapter 3. Egypt and the Education of Ambition. In 1163, Nur al-Din sent Shirkuh to Egypt. The mission was not originally about Saladin. It was about Egypt itself, about the decaying Fatimid Caliphate that controlled the wealthiest territory in the region and could not defend it, and about the uncomfortable reality that if Shirkuh did not move into that vacuum, someone else would. The Crusaders were already involved, already maneuvering, already supporting one Fatimid faction against another, with the strategic patience of men who understood that a weak Egypt was more useful to them than a strong one. Saladin went because Shirkuh brought him. He went By some accounts, reluctantly. The later tradition records him saying that he had no desire to go, that he resisted, that he was persuaded only by the insistence of his uncle and the authority of Nur al-Din behind it. Whether this memory is precise, or whether it has been shaped by the desire to present him as someone who did not reach for power but had power placed in his hands, cannot be known for certain. What can be known is what he did once he arrived. Egypt, in 1163, was a place in the late stages of a particular kind of institutional decay. The Fatimid Caliphate had ruled from Cairo for 2 centuries. It had produced, at its height, a civilization of genuine sophistication, art, scholarship, architecture, a trading empire that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean through the port of Alexandria and the markets of Cairo. The Caliph sat at the center of it all, in a palace complex of extraordinary size and luxury, surrounded by the rituals of a court that had been refined over generations into something closer to theatre than governance. By 1163, the theatre was all that remained. Real power had migrated to the office of the vizier, the chief minister who actually administered the state, commanded the armies, managed the finances, and made the decisions that the caliph ceremonially approved. The vizierate had become a prize, fought over by competing factions with an intensity that had turned the most powerful office in Egypt into the most dangerous one. Viziers rose and fell, and the falling was rarely peaceful. Into this situation came Shirkuh, and beside Shirkuh, watching everything, was Saladin. He watched how the Fatimid court operated, how the ceremonies worked, and what they concealed, how the factions positioned themselves, and where the actual decisions were made and by whom. He watched how his uncle navigated between the demands of Nur al-Din, who had his own strategic interests in Egypt, and the demands of the Egyptian factions, who wanted a protector but not a conqueror. He watched how military force and political negotiation were not alternatives but tools used in combination, each making the other more effective. He was not yet the most important man in any room he entered. He was still learning how to read the rooms. The campaign was long and complicated, and involved more retreats and returns and shifts in alliance than the later legend tends to preserve. Shirkuh entered Egypt, was forced out, returned, was forced into a stalemate, negotiated, and eventually, on his 3rd campaign, succeeded in placing himself as the dominant military power in the country. In 1169, Shirkuh became vizier of Egypt. He died 10 weeks later. The cause was almost certainly the combination of his physical excess and the accumulated strain of years of campaigning in difficult conditions. He was not a young man, and he had not lived like one. His death was sudden enough to leave the factions around him briefly frozen, each calculating what the new landscape looked like before committing to a position. Into that frozen moment stepped Saladin. He was 31 years old. He had not come to Egypt to become its ruler. He had come as his uncle's lieutenant. His uncle's support. It's his uncle's capable nephew who could be trusted to handle specific tasks competently. And now his uncle was gone, and the Fatimid Caliph, al-Adid, apparently calculated that a young man of moderate standing was more controllable than any of the senior Fatimid officials who would otherwise compete for the position. Al-Adid appointed Saladin as vizier. It was a miscalculation that the caliph would not live long enough to fully appreciate. What happened in Egypt over the next 2 years is the clearest early demonstration of how Saladin's mind actually worked. He did not move aggressively. He did not announce his intentions. He consolidated, quietly, systematically, with the patience of a man who understood that power seized too fast is power that has to be defended every day. While power built into a structure defends itself, he replaced Fatimid officials with men loyal to him. He reorganized the military. He managed the caliph with the visible deference appropriate to his position, while systematically removing every source of power that the caliph might have used to check him. He was polite. He was respectful. He gave Al-Adid no obvious reason to feel threatened, until the point at which feeling threatened would have made no practical difference. When Al-Adid died in 1171, Saladin made no theatrical announcement of a new order. He simply stopped having the Fatimid caliph's name read in the Friday prayers. In its place, the name of the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, ended not with a battle or an execution, but with an administrative adjustment, so quiet that many Egyptians understood what had happened only after it was already complete. This was Saladin introducing himself to history, not with a dramatic gesture, with a demonstration of exactly the kind of intelligence that the rest of his life would run on. He understood that the most durable changes are the ones that look, in the moment they are made, like the only natural option. That the best time to make an irreversible decision is when the people who might object are still calculating whether to object at all. He was now the effective ruler of Egypt. He controlled its army, its treasury, its ports, its agricultural surplus that fed the region's ambitions and paid for its wars. He was also, nominally, still the servant of Nur al-Din. And Nur al-Din was watching. The relationship between them, in these years, 1169 to 1174, has the quality of 2 chess players who are officially on the same side, but are also both aware that the board they are sharing has pieces that will eventually need to be resolved. Nur al-Din issued orders. Saladin complied. Partially, Nur al-Din pushed for military coordination against the Crusaders. Saladin found reasons for delay. Consolidation. The need to stabilize Egypt before committing its forces to external campaigns. The delays were real in the sense that Egypt genuinely needed stabilizing. They were also convenient in the sense that every month of consolidation made Saladin stronger and more difficult to displace. Nur al-Din was not deceived. The later record preserves enough of his private communications to make clear that he understood precisely what his vizier in Cairo was doing. He was gathering his own resources, preparing to move on Egypt directly, and remind Saladin of the structural reality that his position existed within a larger authority. He ran out of time. Nur al-Din died in May of 1174. He was 56 years old. His heir was a child of 11, As-Salih, who was immediately surrounded by regents and factions and the competing ambitions of men who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The structure that had contained Saladin's ambitions collapsed overnight. He stood in Cairo, ruler of the wealthiest territory in the region, commander of its most capable army, and looked north at a world that had just lost its organizing principle. The only thing more dangerous than reaching for power, he had learned in Egypt, is being within reach of it and doing nothing. He reached. Chapter 4. The Master's Ceiling. Nur al-Din had built something that most rulers of his era could not just territory, not just military capacity. He had built a language. The language of jihad, as Nur al-Din constructed, it was not the raw emotional cry that had existed since 1099. It was something more structured and more durable. It connected religious obligation to specific political goals. It gave Muslim rulers a vocabulary for cooperation that transcended the normal logic of dynastic competition. It created, for the first time since Jerusalem fell, a framework in which the reclamation of the Holy City was not just a prayer or a grievance, but an active project with institutional support, military direction, and the kind of moral weight that could compel men to act against their immediate self-interest. Nur al-Din had spent his adult life building this language and embedding it into everything he touched. The mosques he funded carried it in their inscriptions. The scholars he patronized carried it in their sermons. He made the memory of Jerusalem into architecture, into law, into the daily texture of governance, in a way that no political upheaval could easily erase. When he died, he left behind a cause that was larger than any individual. He also left behind a child heir, a fractured court, and a collection of powerful men in Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul who each believed they were the natural inheritor of what Nur al-Din had built. Saladin was not among them, not officially, not in the way that bloodline or geographic proximity to the Zengid heartland would have suggested. He was in Cairo, the ruler of a territory that Nur al-Din had sent his uncle to manage, a man whose position derived from service to the dynasty rather than from any claim within it. But Saladin had something none of the others had. He had Egypt. He moved in the summer of 1174, and the speed of it tells you something important about how long he had been thinking about it. Within weeks of Nur al-Din's death, he was already preparing. Within months, he had crossed the Sinai and arrived in Syria with an army that was not large enough to be threatening in purely military terms, but was organized and disciplined and led by a man who had not come to negotiate. He did not announce himself as a conqueror. That framing would have been politically fatal. He announced himself as a protector. He was coming, he said, to defend the interests of As-Salih, Nur al-Din's young heir, against the factions that were tearing the Zengid inheritance apart. He was coming to preserve what Nur al-Din had built, not to take it. The claim was not entirely false. The factions around As-Salih were genuinely destructive. The instability of the Zengid succession was genuinely dangerous. A strong external force imposing order on a collapsing situation was not, by the standards of the medieval political world, an act of pure aggression. It was also not what it claimed to be. Saladin was not interested in preserving the Zengid dynasty. He was interested in absorbing it. He understood that the language Nur al-Din had built, the jihad framework, the moral authority that came with being the champion of Jerusalem, was worth more than any amount of territory taken by naked force. If he could position himself as the legitimate continuation of Nur al-Din's project rather than its usurper, he would inherit not just land and armies, but the consent of the scholars and the clerics and the populations who had organized their political loyalties around that project. He was not wrong. Damascus opened to him, not without resistance, not without the kind of negotiation that required him to make promises and offer concessions and demonstrate that the transition would not mean chaos. But it opened. The city that had been the heart of Nur al-Din's Syria accepted a new organizing principle with the pragmatic calculation of a place that had survived long enough to understand that survival required flexibility. Aleppo was harder. The city had genuine Zengid loyalists, men who had served Nur al-Din personally and who looked at Saladin and saw not a protector but an opportunist wearing the protector's clothes. They held out. They brought in outside help, including, in a move that illustrated the full complexity of the political landscape, approaches to the Crusaders, the common enemy, asking for support against the Muslim ruler who was claiming to unite the Muslim world. This is one of the details about the years of unification that the legend tends to smooth over. Saladin's consolidation of Syria was not a clean story of Muslim unity rallying behind a righteous leader. It was a story of war, pressure, negotiation, and the application of force against people who considered themselves, with some justification, the legitimate representatives of the tradition Saladin claimed to be serving. He besieged Aleppo. He fought against other Muslim armies. He had men killed who had served Nur al-Din loyally. He did all of this while continuing to speak the language of jihad, continuing to position himself as the inheritor of the project rather than the destroyer of the men who had built it. The tension between those two things, what he was doing and what he was saying about what he was doing, is where the moral complexity of this period lives. And it is worth sitting inside that tension rather than resolving it too quickly in either direction. He was not a hypocrite in the simple sense. He genuinely believed. The evidence of his entire later life suggests, in the obligation to Jerusalem, the cause was real for him in a way that went beyond its usefulness as political cover. When he spoke about the reclamation of the holy city, he was not performing a conviction he did not feel, but conviction and ambition are not mutually exclusive. A man can genuinely believe in a cause and also understand that the cause serves his interests, and pursue it with an energy that is fed by both. The question of which one is driving the decision at any given moment is often unanswerable, and the attempt to answer it definitively usually reveals more about the person asking than about the person being asked about. What can be said is this: Nur al-Din built the ceiling. Saladin walked through it, and when he did, the mission stopped belonging to the master and began belonging to the man who could carry it farther. That is not betrayal. The word is too simple and too final for what actually happened. What happened was that Saladin enlarged the inheritance, claimed it, and made it impossible to separate the mission from himself. He became so identified with the project that the question of whether he had the right to lead it gradually became less important than the evidence that he was leading it more effectively than anyone else. By 1176, he controlled Damascus. By 1179, he had forced a recognition from the northern Syrian powers that his authority in the region was the dominant fact. As-Salih, Nur al-Din's young heir, died in 1181 at the age of 17. His death removed the last symbolic obstacle to Saladin's claim to be something more than a powerful outsider managing someone else's inheritance. The road that Nur al-Din had built now had one man's name on it. There is a detail from these years that the sources preserve and that the legend tends to skip because it does not fit the image of the magnanimous conqueror. When Saladin moved against certain Zengid-aligned positions, some of the men who resisted him were people who had served Nur al-Din with genuine loyalty and who believed they were doing the right thing by continuing to resist. He did not treat them gently. The logic of consolidation required that resistance be made expensive, and Saladin understood that logic and applied it. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it, but he was a ruler in the full meaning of that word, which means he made decisions that caused suffering, and he made them with the clarity of someone who had decided that the goal justified the cost. This is the Saladin who would arrive at the gates of Jerusalem in 1187, not the saint, not the monster, the man who had spent 13 years learning, in the hardest possible school, that the world does not give you the ceiling. You have to build through it yourself. And when you do, something always breaks on the way up. He knew this. He had been the thing that broke for other people. He understood the cost of it in a way that only someone who has paid it in both directions can understand. It would matter later. When he stood inside a city that expected him to be what 1099 had been, it would matter that he already knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a man who had convinced himself that his cause was large enough to justify whatever it required. He had been that man. He did not want to become him again. Chapter 5. The Hard Work of Unity. In the spring of 1180, Saladin sat in Cairo and looked at a map that was not yet true. Egypt was his. Damascus was his. The road north ran through cities that were still technically someone else's. He had been patient for 13 years. He had watched and waited, and built, and consolidated. And now Nur al-Din was dead, and the child heir was gone, and the territories that the master had built were pulling apart under the pressure of men who shared the name of the cause, but not the will to serve it. The question was not whether Saladin would move. The question was how he would move, and what kind of world he could build that was strong enough to do what no single ruler had managed in nearly a century. The answer required more than military force. Syria was more complicated than Egypt. The cities of Damascus and Aleppo and the territories between them had their own political cultures, their own powerful families, their own histories of loyalty and rivalry that predated Saladin and would outlast him if he gave them the opportunity. He governed Syria through a combination of direct administration in the places he trusted most and a careful distribution of authority to family members and close associates elsewhere. The Ayyubid family became the instrument of empire. His brothers, his nephews, his sons, as they grew old enough, were placed in positions of authority across the territories he controlled, creating a network of personal loyalty overlaid onto the existing political landscape. It was not a perfect system. Family loyalty is its own kind of unreliable, subject to the ambitions and resentments that proximity to power generates. But it was more reliable than the alternative. He also continued what Nur al-Din had started, using the language of jihad as political communication with a precision that its originator would have recognized. The Friday sermons in the mosques of his territories were coordinated. Scholars who shared his theological orientation were supported and elevated. The specific framing of the obligation to Jerusalem, the argument that every Muslim ruler's legitimacy was connected to his contribution to the project of reclamation, was made so consistently and so publicly that the rulers who were not contributing found themselves having to explain why. This put the powers around Mosul in a difficult position. The Zengid rulers of Mosul were the most significant holdouts against Saladin's regional authority. They had their own claims to legitimacy, their own history of service to the cause, their own sense that an upstart from Egypt had no right to present himself as the sole inheritor of what the Zengid dynasty had built. The negotiations between Saladin and Mosul were long and often bitter, conducted through exchanges of letters that mixed theological argument with barely concealed pressure and occasional genuine diplomatic creativity. By 1186, Saladin had forced much of the region into a political order that could point toward Jerusalem, even if not every piece of it truly belonged to him. Egypt and Damascus were his absolutely. Aleppo had accepted his authority. The rulers around Mosul had signed arrangements that acknowledged, through whatever face-saving language the diplomats could construct, that they would not obstruct his campaign. This was not perfect unity. Perfect unity was not available. What he had built was something more achievable and in some ways more impressive, a functional coalition held together by enough shared interest and enough understanding of the alternative that it could be directed toward a common goal. The Crusader states had been watching all of this, with the specific anxiety of people who understand that the world around them is changing in ways they cannot stop. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the early 1180s, was a state under internal stress that its external posture could not fully conceal. The question of succession had produced factional conflict of the kind that weakens institutions from the inside before the external pressure arrives. Baldwin IV, the leper king, was genuinely capable and genuinely committed to the defense of the kingdom, but his illness imposed limits on what he could personally do and created a vacuum around him that ambitious men competed to fill. Saladin tested the borders, not always with full military commitment, not always with the intention of holding what he took. He tested to learn, to identify weaknesses, to understand how the Crusader military machine responded under pressure, and where its response was slowest. He also made truces. He understood truces as instruments of statecraft rather than sacred obligations. He honored them, renewed them, tested their edges, and allowed them to expire when the political moment changed. In his world, as in the world of every ruler of his era, agreements were pauses in a war that everyone involved understood might resume. The pause he was waiting for ended with a man named Reynold of Chatillon. Reynold was many things, but subtle was not among them. He had arrived in the Crusader states as a young knight and had built a career on the kind of bold aggression that the early Crusades had rewarded and the mature Crusader states could no longer afford. He held the castle of Kerak in Transjordan, which sat astride the trade routes connecting Egypt to Syria, and he treated those trade routes as a personal resource. He raided caravans. He violated truces. He attacked pilgrims. He launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea that threatened the approaches to Mecca and Medina in a way that the Muslim world found not just strategically dangerous, but theologically offensive. He was, in the most precise sense, the kind of man that a careful political operator like Saladin could not have designed better if he had tried. In 1186, Reynold attacked a major caravan moving between Egypt and Syria. The caravan was traveling under the protection of a truce. Saladin sent a message to the king of Jerusalem, demanding that Reynold be brought to account. Nothing happened. Reynold gave Saladin the kind of cause that could unite anger, law, honor, and strategy into a single decision, not a manufactured pretext, a genuine one, a violation so clear and so public that Saladin could call on every obligation he had been building toward for 15 years. Religious, legal, personnel, and political, and have them all point in the same direction. He had his cause. He began to prepare. The army he assembled in the spring of 1187 was the product of everything he had built since he first crossed the Sinai 13 years earlier. Egyptian troops, Syrian troops, forces from the territories that had accepted his authority under varying degrees of enthusiasm. It was not a perfect instrument. No army assembled from a coalition of interests ever is, but it was coherent in a way that the Crusader enemy would not fully appreciate until it was too late. He moved in the early summer, with a speed and a precision that told anyone watching that the man leading this army had been planning it in detail for a very long time. The Crusader kingdom mobilized everything it had and rode directly into what was waiting for them. Chapter 6. Hattin, the day the kingdom broke. The 4th of July, 1187. The Horns of Hattin is a volcanic formation in northern Galilee, two peaks rising from the plateau above the Sea of Galilee like the remnants of something that burned out long ago. The plateau around it in July is dry in the way that land is dry when it has been absorbing summer heat for weeks. The grass gone to yellow. The water sources sparse and widely spaced. the air carrying the particular weight of a heat that does not break at night. Saladin chose this ground carefully. The Crusader army that arrived on that plateau on the 3rd and 4th of July was the largest the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever put into the field. Nearly 20,000 men, including the core of the kingdom's heavy cavalry. The knights, who were the most effective military force in the region, and who could not easily be replaced if they were lost. Guy of Lusignan, the king, had emptied every garrison, stripped every castle, called in every obligation, the army marching north from Safuria toward the relief of Tiberias, which Saladin had besieged specifically to draw them out, represented not just the military capacity of the kingdom, but its existential bet on a single engagement. This was, from Saladin's perspective, exactly what he had worked to produce. The debate in the Crusader camp the night before they moved had been sharp. Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most experienced military minds in the kingdom, argued against the march. Tiberias was his own city. His own wife was inside it. And even he was arguing that the risk of marching across dry terrain toward a Muslim army that controlled the water sources was greater than the risk of letting Tiberias fall. He had fought Saladin before. He knew what it looked like when a trap was being constructed. Reynold of Chatillon argued for the march. His logic was the logic of a man who had built his reputation on aggression and could not afford to be seen advocating caution. His voice, and the voices of others who shared his temperament, carried. The army moved. What followed over the next 36 hours was not a battle in the conventional sense. A clash of organized forces on a chosen field with a clear beginning and end. It was a dismantling. Saladin's forces harassed the Crusader column as it moved, cutting off its access to water, setting fire to the dry grass so that smoke added to the heat and thirst, probing and retreating and probing again, never committing to a full engagement, but never allowing rest. The Crusader infantry, suffering worst from the heat and thirst, began to break formation. The cavalry could not operate effectively without the infantry support that was dissolving around them. By the morning of the 4th of July, the Crusader army had stopped on the plateau near the horns of Hattin because it could not continue. Not because it had chosen to make it stand there, but because the men could no longer march. The horses were dying. The infantry was sitting down in the middle of a battle because thirst had made them unable to stand. Saladin completed the destruction of a military force that had already destroyed itself. The kingdom's cavalry made desperate charges that Saladin's forces absorbed and surrounded. The infantry that had broken was cut down or captured. The true cross, the relic that the Crusader army carried as its sacred standard, and that was understood by the people who followed it as a physical connection to the divine authority behind their cause, was taken. Its loss was not just a military event. It was a theological statement that hit the Christian world with a force that the purely military accounts cannot fully capture. When the fighting was over, Saladin sat in his tent and received the prisoners. Guy of Lusignan, the king, was brought in. Saladin had iced water brought and offered it to Guy, who drank and then passed the cup to Reynold of Chatillon beside him. In the hospitality customs of the region, to offer a man food or drink was to extend him a guarantee of safety. Saladin stopped Guy before Reynold drank. The water was not offered to Reynold. The king gave it to him. Not me. He had sworn to kill Reynold personally. He had made that oath publicly after the caravan attack, in front of men whose memory of it was precise. The public oath and the private intention had been the same thing, and he saw no reason to separate them now. He stood. He offered Reynold the chance to convert, which Reynold refused with the directness that had characterized everything else about the man. And then Saladin killed him, drawing his own sword and striking the blow himself. A personal act in the middle of an enormous military operation that tells you something true about the specific weight he placed on certain kinds of obligation. Honor kept and honor broken were not abstract categories for him. They were the architecture of a world that could function. Reynold had spent years demonstrating that he regarded that architecture as optional. Saladin's response was not rage. It was conclusion. Guy, he kept alive and eventually released. The logic was different and equally deliberate. A living former king who had been treated well was a demonstration of something. A dead one was simply another body. The other prisoners numbered in the thousands. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, were executed. This decision is sometimes presented as a contradiction of the mercy Saladin would show at Jerusalem, but it was not inconsistent by the standards he was applying. The military orders were professional religious warriors who had sworn oaths to fight the Muslim world indefinitely and who, if ransomed or released, would simply return to doing exactly that. They were, in his calculation, a category of combatant for whom the normal prisoner logic did not apply. The decision was cold. It was not random. The true cross disappeared into Saladin's possession and was never recovered. After Hattin, the Crusader kingdom ceased to exist as a military force. The castles that remained were garrisoned by skeleton crews. City after city fell over the following weeks with a speed that reflected not Saladin's military pressure alone, but the collapse of any organized will to resist. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, Sidon, Beirut. By September of 1187, the road to Jerusalem was open. There was almost nothing left between him and the city that he had spent 15 years. And the Muslim world had spent 88 years. Moving toward, he had not yet decided, fully and finally, what he would do when he arrived. The decision he was moving toward was not a military one. It never had been. Chapter 7. Jerusalem. The Heart Chapter. Jerusalem, in September of 1187, was a city that knew what was coming and could not stop it. The population inside the walls had swelled far beyond what the city could comfortably hold. Refugees from the countryside, from the cities that had already fallen, from the estates and villages that had emptied as Saladin's campaign moved westward, had poured through the gates in the weeks after Hattin. The city that had perhaps 20,000 permanent residents now held something closer to 60,000 people, many of them with nowhere else to go and nothing left except the walls between them and whatever came next. The walls were not enough. Everyone inside Jerusalem understood the military reality. The garrison was desperately undermanned. The knights who would normally have defended the city were dead on the plateau above the Sea of Galilee, or sitting in Saladin's prison camps, or scattered across the collapsed kingdom trying to reach the coast. What remained were old men, boys, merchants, priests, and a handful of fighting men under the command of Balian of Ibelin, who had come into the city intending only to collect his family and had been persuaded, or perhaps cornered, into staying and taking command of its defense. Balian was not a man who indulged in illusions. He organized the defense because organization was better than chaos, not because he believed it would change the outcome. He dubbed every male over 16 a knight, because the ceremony had meaning for the people receiving it, even if the military reality behind it was thin. He managed the resources, rationed the food, kept the walls manned, and prepared himself for the conversation he already knew was coming. What most of the people inside Jerusalem were thinking about in the sleepless nights of September 1187 was 1099. They knew the story. It was not ancient history to them. It was living memory in the specific way that traumatic collective events stay alive across generations, passed down not just as information but as emotional knowledge. They knew what had happened in this city when the last conquest came. They knew that the man now camped outside their walls was the man on the other side of that story, the inheritor of everything that 1099 had wounded. They were waiting to find out if he intended to answer it in kind. Saladin began the siege in the last days of September. He probed the northern walls first, found them better defended than he expected, and shifted his assault to the western section near the Mount of Olives, where the terrain offered his siege engines better positioning. The walls were struck, sections were undermined, the defenders stretched too thin across too long a perimeter, could not be everywhere at once. Within a week, it was clear that the city could not hold. Balian came to negotiate. The meeting between Balian of Ibelin and Saladin is one of those historical encounters that the sources preserve in enough detail to give it texture, even if the exact words are filtered through layers of chroniclers who wrote them down afterward. What is clear is that Balian came without illusions about his military position and with a very specific card to play. If Saladin refused terms, Balian said, the defenders of Jerusalem would destroy everything inside the walls before surrendering. The mosques, the Dome of the Rock, the sacred spaces that Saladin had spent his entire campaign presenting as the reason for the campaign. They would kill the Muslim prisoners held inside the city. They would leave Saladin a ruin rather than a prize. It was a threat from a man with no real power, which is the only kind of threat a man with no real power can make, and it was credible enough to matter. Saladin negotiated. The terms that emerged were not simple mercy. They were a structured arrangement that reflected the full complexity of what he was trying to accomplish. Every Christian resident of Jerusalem could purchase their freedom. Men at a price, women at a lower price, children lower still. Those who could not pay would become prisoners. The city would be surrendered in an orderly fashion. The Christian holy sites would be respected. The garrison would be allowed to leave. Within the terms, there was already more restraint than 1099 had shown, but the terms were also not unconditional generosity. People who could not pay the ransom faced enslavement. The poor, the refugees who had arrived with nothing, the people who had been displaced by the campaign and had no resources left, faced a future inside those terms that was not merciful in any uncomplicated sense. What happened next is where the story becomes something more than a negotiated surrender. Balian told Saladin that there were thousands of people inside the city who could not pay. Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, asked for a group of prisoners as a personal gift from his brother and then freed them. Saladin himself ordered the release of the elderly and others who could not pay. The accounts vary in their details and their numbers, but they agree on the shape of it. The ransom system, as rigidly applied, would have meant enslavement for an enormous portion of the population, and Saladin intervened in ways that reduced that outcome significantly. He did not free everyone. He could not, or would not, absorb the political cost of voiding the ransom system entirely, which was also a demonstration to his own forces that victory produced rewards. The line he walked was not a line between pure mercy and pure calculation. It was a line between what the situation allowed and what the situation had been expected to demand. The city fell on the 2nd of October, 87, Saladin entered Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock, which had been used as a church and had a cross mounted on its roof. Had that cross removed and was restored to its original function. The process was carried out according to the legal and ritual requirements of the tradition. He understood that the manner of restoration was as important as the restoration itself. He prayed. The city, that had been the center of his entire adult project, was now in his hands. The cross was coming down from the dome. The Crusader flags were being removed from the walls. The 88-year interruption was over, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, doing the work of administration and transition, and the 1,000 decisions that a conquered city requires in its first hours, was the man who had built his entire identity around arriving at this moment. If he felt the completion he had imagined across 15 years of building toward this gate, the sources do not show it. What they show is a man immediately pulled into the next demand, the next negotiation, the next strategic calculation, the next thing the mission required. He had arrived. Arrival was not what he had expected it to be. The Eastern Christians, the Orthodox communities who had lived in Jerusalem under Crusader rule, could stay. They were not required to leave. Would Wattig, the city that was being emptied of its Latin Christian population, was not being emptied of Christianity itself. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was closed for 3 days and then reopened. Its Christian custodians restored to their positions. He did not destroy it. He did not convert it. He closed it briefly, which was a statement, and then returned it, which was a larger one. The distinction was careful and deliberate. He was not making a gesture of universal religious tolerance in the modern sense of that phrase. He was making a precise statement about what the reclamation of Jerusalem meant and did not mean. It did not mean the city belonged to one faith alone. It meant the city was no longer held by force against the traditions that had existed in it before 1099. Balian of Ibelin left Jerusalem as he had agreed. He rode out through the gates of a city he had defended with almost nothing, past the army that had taken it from him, into whatever came next for a man whose kingdom had ceased to exist. The accounts that surround his departure do not record everything he thought or said. What they preserve, in the formal language of the period, is a portrait of the man he left behind, not the enemy, not the conqueror who had to be endured, something that the crusading tradition had almost no vocabulary for. A man who had besieged his city, negotiated its surrender, managed its transition, and conducted himself throughout in a way that Balian, who had been on the receiving end of all of it, could not honestly describe as anything other than honorable. He had not expected that. No one inside those walls had expected that. The world expected 1099, answered with 1099. He answered it with something else. Not because he was incapable of the other answer. That is the thing that mattered. He had the power. He had, almost certainly, the anger. He had every justification that the logic of holy war and the memory of that first conquest could provide. He chose differently. The way you take something is part of what you are taking. He understood this. A city reclaimed through massacre would be a different city than a city reclaimed through the demonstration that its new ruler was not what the old story had made him. Some victories, if won in the wrong way, become their own defeat. The mission that had built him and refused to release him had brought him to that gate. It had taken everything he had to arrive there. And when he arrived, and the mission was complete, and the world was watching to find out what kind of man he was, he made the choice that he would be remembered for, not the taking of the city, the manner of the taking. The mission had been completed. The mission had not released him, because what came after Jerusalem was not the ending the mission had promised. It was Europe. And Europe, when it heard what had happened in October of 1187, did not respond with admiration for the quality of his restraint. It responded with an army. Chapter 8. Europe answers. The news reached Rome in late October of 1187. Pope Gregory VIII had been pope for 8 days. He had been elected into a church already shaken by rumors from the east, and the confirmation of those rumors, Jerusalem fallen, the true cross captured, the kingdom destroyed, arrived in the first weeks of his papacy, like a verdict on everything the crusading enterprise had built over the previous century. He issued a papal letter, Audita Tremendi. Within weeks of his election, the letter did not simply call for a new crusade. It interpreted the fall of Jerusalem as divine punishment for the sins of the Christian world, a theological framework that placed the loss not in the category of military failure, but in the category of spiritual failure, requiring spiritual response. It was one of the most effective pieces of political communication of the medieval period. The letter moved through Europe with the speed of something that had found the emotional landscape it needed. The grief was real. Jerusalem was not an abstraction to the Christian world of 1187. It was the place where the central events of the faith had occurred. It was the destination of pilgrimage, the subject of prayer, the city that appeared in the imagination of every Christian in Europe who had ever listened to a sermon or looked at the decoration of a church. Its loss was experienced as personal and theological simultaneously. The response was unprecedented in scale. The Saladin tithe, a tax of 1/10 on income and property, was levied across multiple European kingdoms to fund the campaign. People who had never considered crusading submitted to a mandatory financial obligation because the political and religious machinery behind the tithe made non-compliance more costly than compliance. 3 kings took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the oldest and in many ways the most formidable. He was in his late 60s. An experienced military commander who had led armies across Europe for decades. He marched overland through the Balkans and into Anatolia with a force that was certainly enormous by the standards of the era. He drowned crossing the Salef River in June of 1190. The cause was unclear. The accounts contradictory. What was not unclear was the effect. The German crusade effectively dissolved after his death. A portion of his army continued to the Holy Land. The rest went home. Philip II of France and Richard I of England came by sea. They left in 1190, travelled separately, and arrived in the Middle East in the spring and summer of 1191. Saladin had known this was coming from the moment Jerusalem fell. He was not a man who made the mistake of confusing a military victory with the end of a war. He understood, with the clarity that 15 years of careful strategic thinking had built into him, that the fall of Jerusalem would produce exactly the response it produced. The cross, falling from the dome of the rock, was a signal that would travel across the Mediterranean and land in European courts and cathedrals and be converted, through the alchemy of grief and obligation and the way that religious and political pressure reinforce each other, into armies. He used the time between Jerusalem and the arrival of those armies as best he could. Tyre was the failure that would define the limits of his momentum. Conrad of Montferrat had arrived in Tyre by the specific kind of timing that looks like chance and is actually the result of a man paying close attention. He had sailed into the harbour, not knowing that Jerusalem had fallen, learned the situation immediately, and made the decision that would prove strategically crucial. He refused to surrender. He organized the defense. He transformed what should have been a straightforward completion of the campaign into a prolonged siege that Saladin eventually abandoned. Tyre mattered because Tyre survived. It became the foothold from which the Crusader counterattack would be organized. It became the port through which Richard and Philip would arrive. If Tyre had fallen in 1187, along with the rest of the kingdom, the Third Crusade would have had no base from which to operate. Saladin had the military capacity to press the siege harder and longer than he did. He chose not to. His army was tired. The campaign had been running for months. His forces needed rest, and the kind of restoration that only comes from a pause. He calculated that Tyre was not worth the cost of continued effort. He was wrong. This is one of the places in his story where the legend does him a disservice by being too smooth. He made mistakes. Tyre was a consequential one. The man who had been so precise in building toward Hattin was, after Hattin, running a campaign on momentum and his army's limits. And the calculation about Tyre was a calculation that the next 5 years would prove incorrect in ways that cost him more than the siege would have. But in 1187 and 1188, the scale of what he had accomplished made individual errors look smaller than they were. He had also, in winning, guaranteed himself a war he could not end. An offensive campaign generates momentum and rewards. It gives the men who are part of it the forward feeling of progress, the sense that the cause is moving and they are moving with it. A defensive campaign is a different kind of demand. It requires holding what has been taken against people who are determined to take it back, which requires a different quality of commitment and produces a different quality of exhaustion. His army had been in the field for months. Jerusalem was won. The religious and emotional energy that had carried them through the campaign had been discharged in the surrender and the restoration of the mosque and the prayers that followed. What remained was the harder, less inspiring obligation of defending what had been taken against an enemy that had not yet arrived but was certainly coming. Saladin won the city and awakened a continent. When Richard of England finally arrived on the shores of the Holy Land in the summer of 1191, he arrived to find a Muslim world that had won its great victory and was now defending it against the specific quality of opponent that the Third Crusade had produced. Richard was not like the men who had ridden into Hattin. He was not Guy of Lusignan, paralyzed by faction and bad advice. He was not Reynald of Chatillon, governed by aggression that could not calculate consequences. He was something Saladin had not yet encountered in 4 years of fighting the Crusader kingdom. He was a peer, and the confrontation between them would test everything that the restraint of Jerusalem had built, in ways that neither man had fully anticipated, and that neither one would fully survive intact. Chapter 9. The Lionheart and the Sultan. Richard of England arrived at Acre in June of 1191, and immediately changed the nature of the war. Acre had been under siege by the remnant Crusader forces since 1189. Guy of Lusignan, released by Saladin on a promise not to take up arms again, had broken that promise. With the speed of a man who understood that a promise made under duress to an enemy was not the kind of obligation his world required him to honor, and had gathered what forces remained and begun pressing the coastal city. The siege had been running for nearly 2 years. Inconclusive and brutal. The Crusaders unable to take the city, and Saladin unable to relieve it effectively. Richard changed the arithmetic. He brought engineering capability, naval support, money, and the specific quality of military command that the Crusader effort had been lacking. His ability to coordinate combined forces, to manage logistics, to maintain the morale and discipline of troops that had been sitting outside Acre for 2 years, while disease and attrition reduced them, was of a different order than anything the campaign had previously produced. Acre fell on the 12th of July, 1191. What happened next sits in the history of the Third Crusade as one of its defining moments, and it sits there uncomfortably for everyone who wants the story to be clean. Richard had taken approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners in the fall of Acre. The terms of the surrender had included arrangements for their ransom and release. The negotiations over those arrangements stalled. Saladin did not meet the deadlines. Whether the delays were strategic, logistical, or the result of genuine difficulty in assembling the agreed terms is a question the sources do not resolve cleanly. On the 20th of August, 1191, Richard ordered the prisoners executed. The killing took place in view of Saladin's army. It was not an act of rage or battlefield chaos. It was a decision made by a man who calculated that the prisoners had become a logistical burden and a strategic liability, and who applied to that calculation the logic of a commander who needed to move his army and could not move it while managing thousands of prisoners under ongoing threat of attack. The logic was coherent by the standards of medieval military practice. It was also a massacre. Saladin watched from the hills. What he felt in that moment, the sources do not record with any precision. What he did is recorded clearly. He did not retaliate by massacring Christian prisoners in kind. He did not order a response that would have converted the episode into a cycle of atrocity. He contained whatever he was experiencing and continued the strategic calculation. This matters, not because it erases what Richard did, which nothing can erase, but because it tells you something about the specific quality of the man watching from the hills. He had the capacity to respond in kind. He had the men. He had the prisoners. He had the emotional material for it, and he chose not to answer it that way. The war continued. Richard moved south along the coast toward Jaffa with a discipline and a precision that demonstrated why he was considered the finest military commander of his generation. The march from Acre to Jaffa, conducted in the brutal heat of August and September, with the army maintaining formation under constant harassment from Saladin's forces, is studied in military history as an example of sustained operational discipline. Richard's forces did not break. They absorbed the attacks, maintained their order, and moved. Saladin attacked at Arsuf in September of 1191. He was trying to break the column, to shatter the formation that was making Richard's army so difficult to damage. His cavalry hit the rear of the march in waves, probing for the moment when the pressure would become too great and the formation would fracture. The Hospitallers at the rear broke formation first, not in panic, but in the frustration of men who had been absorbing cavalry charges for hours and who finally turned and charged back. Richard, who had been trying to hold the order until the moment of his choosing, had to convert the unauthorized charge into a controlled counterattack or watch it become a rout. He converted it. The charge that followed was effective enough to force Saladin's cavalry to withdraw. Arsuf was a crusader tactical victory. It was also a demonstration of Saladin's limits. The army that had destroyed the crusader kingdom at Hattin was a different instrument than the army that fought at Arsuf. It had been in the field for years. It had won its great victory, and was now defending against an opponent who brought fresh energy and professional capability to a war that Saladin's forces had been sustaining through faith and the momentum of Jerusalem. The emotional fuel that had powered the campaign from 1187 was not inexhaustible. He felt this. He knew his army felt it. The letters he wrote in this period, some of which survive, carry a quality of sustained effort that is different from the confidence of the years before Hattin. He was managing now, managing the coalition, managing the army's exhaustion, managing the political pressures from the territories he had left to pursue the campaign, managing the reality that the man he was fighting was not going to make the mistakes that Guy of Lusignan had made. Richard pressed toward Jerusalem twice. The first time, in the winter of 1191 and 92. The advance came within 12 miles of the city. Saladin destroyed the wells and the food sources in the region between the coast and Jerusalem, making supply impossible. Richard, whose logistical judgment was as sharp as his tactical ability, recognized that he could not sustain a siege in those conditions and turned back. The second advance, in the summer of 1192, came even closer. From the high ground at Beit Nuba, Richard could see the city in the distance. He turned back again. The decision was not military cowardice. It was the calculation of a man who understood that taking Jerusalem without the forces to hold it was worse than not taking it. A city taken and lost again would be more damaging to the crusading enterprise than a city not taken. The support for the crusade in Europe was not unlimited. The forces under his command were already stretched. The supply lines were long. Saladin had fortified the city and positioned his forces to make a siege enormously costly. Richard was a professional. He counted what he had and what it could buy. What it could buy was not Jerusalem. They never met face to face. The sources that describe meetings between them are later embellishments, the product of a tradition that wanted to give the story the dramatic confrontation it seemed to deserve. What actually passed between them was a series of negotiations conducted through intermediaries, exchanges of messages and occasionally of gifts, and the specific kind of communication that enemies conduct when they are trying to find the shape of an agreement that will allow both of them to stop fighting without appearing to have lost. There are accounts of Richard falling ill during the campaign, and Saladin sending him fruit and ice from the mountains. There are accounts of gestures of personal regard passing between enemies who were conducting a war in public and something more complicated in private. The details are often disputed and sometimes clearly legendary. What is not disputed is the shape of the relationship. Two men who could not defeat each other and who found, in that mutual limitation, something that neither of them had expected to find in a holy war, a kind of recognition. Richard recognized in Saladin a commander whose quality matched his own, in the dimensions that Richard understood most precisely: the organizational intelligence, the ability to hold a coalition together under pressure, the strategic patience that had built toward Hattin and was now sustaining a defense against the best army Europe had sent east in a century. Saladin recognized in Richard something similar, and something that was, in certain ways, more complicated for him. Richard was the proof that the victory at Hattin and the taking of Jerusalem had not resolved the situation. He was the demonstration that winning the great battle and taking the holy city had not ended the war. He was the argument that the mission was still unfinished, would perhaps always be unfinished, and that the man who had built his life around completing it would spend whatever remained of that life in the space between the completion and the peace that should have followed. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed in September of 1192. By its terms, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The coastal cities that Richard had taken remained in Crusader hands. Christian pilgrims and unarmed visitors would be allowed access to the holy sites. The agreement would last 3 years. It satisfied no one. It was exactly the kind of agreement that serious men make when they have run out of the capacity to continue and cannot afford to admit it directly. It was a pause dressed as a resolution. It left the fundamental questions entirely unanswered. Richard left the Holy Land in October of 1192. He had come to take Jerusalem, and he was leaving without it. Saladin, watching the ships go, had held Jerusalem. He had not defeated Richard. He had not been defeated by Richard. He had survived the best military effort the Christian world could produce for a generation, sustained a defense across 5 years of continuous campaigning, and preserved the central achievement of his life against the man who had come specifically to undo it. He was 54 years old. He was exhausted in a way that the later accounts cannot fully convey, but that his physical condition in the months after the treaty made visible. The years of campaigning had accumulated in his body in the way that sustained effort accumulates, as a debt that the energy of the cause had been deferring, and that now, with the cause momentarily paused, presented itself for payment. He rode back to Damascus. He had been at war, more or less continuously, since 1187. He had taken Jerusalem, defended it, negotiated a peace that preserved it, and arrived on the other side of all of it, with something that was not what he had been promised when he was young, and the mission was new, and Jerusalem was still a horizon. He had the city. He did not have what the city was supposed to give him. He rode into Damascus, and the world asked him for the next thing. It always would. Chapter 10. What victory could not save. Damascus. The autumn of 1192, he arrived in the city he had loved longest. The city where he had grown up in the shadow of Nur al-Din's court and learned, before he had the words for it, what power looked like from the inside. Damascus was not Cairo, which was administrative and vast and organized around the machinery of empire. Damascus was personal. It had the texture of a place he had chosen rather than inherited. And in the last months of his life, he returned to it the way people return to the places that knew them before they became what they became. He was not well. The physical evidence of what the years had cost him was no longer something that could be managed through will or deflected through the momentum of a campaign. He had been in the field, almost without interruption, since the spring of 1187, 5 years of campaigning across the breadth of the Holy Land, managing a coalition, sustaining a defense against the most capable military force the Christian world had assembled in a generation, making the decisions that keep an army functioning and a political structure intact under the kind of pressure that dissolves lesser constructions. The body keeps its own account. It absorbs what the mind insists can be deferred and presents the balance when the deferral runs out. His doctors noted the exhaustion. The sources that survive from this period describe a man who was moving more slowly, sleeping less well, eating without appetite, managing the business of his territories from Damascus with the administrative attention that had always characterized him, but with a physical diminishment that the people around him could see and that he seems to have understood clearly. He was 54 years old. He had lived at a pace and under a pressure that extracted more from the body than ordinary life demanded. He had also, in the particular way of men who have spent themselves entirely on something external, not kept much for himself. There is an account, preserved in the sources, of a man who came to Saladin's court with a debt he could not pay, and left with the debt cleared, and something additional besides. The accounts of this kind are numerous enough that they form a pattern rather than an exception. His secretaries recorded the distributions. His treasury officers tried to manage them. Neither the recording nor the managing changed what happened when the next person arrived with a genuine need. He gave to scholars. He gave to soldiers. He gave to the poor with a regularity that his treasury officers found difficult to manage, because the supply of people presenting genuine need was not bounded in any way that accounting could organize. He gave when the treasury was full, and he gave when it was not. The pattern of his giving was so consistent and so systematic that it cannot be understood as impulse or performance. He had accumulated an enormous amount of power. He had fought for it, organized it, defended it, and used it to accomplish the central project of his life. And he had, throughout the years of accumulating and using it, persistently declined to convert it into the kind of personal wealth that rulers of his position routinely accumulated. The palaces and the territories and the military resources were the instruments of the mission, not the rewards of it. This is a coherent way to live. It is also, examined from a certain angle, a way of ensuring that the mission remains necessary. A man who has given everything to the cause has nothing left if the cause ends. The cause, therefore, cannot be allowed to end. The mission that would not release him was also, in this sense, a mission he would not release. He knew this. Perhaps he was not a man given to self-deception about the mechanics of his own choices, but knowing the structure of something and being able to step outside it are different capabilities. And by 1192, he had been inside the structure for long enough that outside it was not a place he could clearly imagine. The administration of the territories he controlled continued. Letters went out and came in. Decisions were made about taxation and justice and the management of the borders that the Treaty of Jaffa had redrawn. His sons were old enough now to be given responsibilities, and he distributed authority among them with the care of a man who understood that the dynasty he had built was more fragile than it appeared, and that the transition to the next generation would test the structure in ways that his presence had been preventing. He received visitors, scholars and officials and petitioners, and the various figures of the Islamic world who wanted to be in the presence of the man who had taken Jerusalem and held it against Richard of England. He received them with the courtesy that had always characterized him, the quality of attention that people remembered long afterward, the sense that in conversation with him they were genuinely being heard rather than merely processed. He also, in these months, spent time with the Quran. The sources note this without elaborating on what it meant to him. He had always been religiously serious, with the depth of a man for whom the faith was not a costume worn for political purposes, but a framework that organized experience and gave it meaning. The years of the campaign had been framed, for him and for everyone around him. In the language of that faith, Jerusalem had been the proof that the framework was not empty. What the faith offered him now, in the autumn and winter after the campaign, was something different from what it had offered him in the years of building and fighting. Not a task, not an obligation. The dimension of practice that exists when the immediate demand has been met and the relationship between the believer and what he believes has room to breathe. He spent time in it. The sources suggest a quality of return. A man going back to something he had been moving through too fast for too long. In February of 1193, a delegation of pilgrims arrived in Damascus, and he greeted them personally, accompanying them to the holy sites within the city. It was the kind of gesture he had made throughout his career, the visible expression of the commitment to pilgrimage rites that the Treaty of Jaffa had formalized. He was honoring the agreement not as a technicality, but as a practice. He came back from that accompaniment with a fever. The fever did not break. The doctors tried what the medicine of his era could provide. The fever worsened over days. There were periods of delirium. There were periods of clarity in which he was recognizably himself, attending to the business around him with the habits of a lifetime that did not know how to stop. His biographer and companion Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad was present in these final days and recorded what he witnessed with the specificity of someone who understood that he was watching the end of something that history would want to know about. He recorded the details of the illness, the progression of the fever, the way Saladin moved in and out of consciousness. He recorded the moments of prayer, the verses recited by the scholar at the bedside as the illness deepened, and the moment when Saladin, hearing the words being read, responded to them. The response was the last sign of recognition before the end. He died on the 4th of March, 1193. He was 55 years old. He had taken Jerusalem and held it. He had built the Ayyubid dynasty and distributed its governance among his family in ways that he hoped would sustain what he had built. When his treasurer assessed his personal estate, the accounts recorded something that later generations would repeat and reshape into legend, but that began as a simple financial fact. Later accounts remembered it as a single gold dinar and a handful of silver dirhams. Not enough, the story goes, to cover the cost of his burial. The specific numbers vary across the sources, as numbers in stories of this kind always vary, polished and simplified by the needs of the people preserving them. But the shape of the account is consistent across enough independent sources to reflect something real. The man who had controlled the treasury of Egypt and Syria and the revenues of a significant portion of the medieval Middle East died with personal wealth that was negligible by any ordinary standard. This was not poverty inflicted by misfortune. It was the result of a lifetime of choices made with full awareness of what they were. He had understood, apparently from early in his career, that what a ruler accumulates is not the measure of what a ruler is worth. He had organized his life around a different measure. The city was still his when he died. It was, in the end, the only thing he kept. His sons began fighting over the inheritance within weeks of his death. The Ayyubid dynasty fractured with a speed that would have been visible to anyone who had been watching its internal structure carefully. He had built it by making himself indispensable to its coherence, by being the organizing force that converted the competing interests of his family members and his coalition partners into a unified direction. When he was gone, the organizing force was gone, and the competing interests reasserted themselves with the logic of things that had been held in check by a single hand. Jerusalem itself would pass back into Crusader hands in 1229 through a negotiated agreement made by his nephew Al-Kamil with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. The arrangement was pragmatic and almost universally condemned by the religious establishment on both sides, which may be the most accurate measure of how good an agreement it actually was. It lasted until 1244, when Jerusalem fell again and stayed in Muslim hands for the next 7 centuries. The dynasty he built did not survive him in the form he had built it. The peace he had purchased with the Treaty of Jaffa lasted 3 years, as agreed, and then the conflict continued. The Crusader states persisted in diminished form for another century, before the last of them fell at Acre in 1291. He did not save the region from its history. No single person is ever able to do that. Regardless of how much they accomplish within the portion of history that belongs to them, what he accomplished within his portion was specific and real and largely lasting, and the manner of Jerusalem lasted longest and travelled furthest. The story of what he had done at the gates of the city in October of 1187 moved through the medieval world in the years after his death, with the specific energy of a story that confirms something people needed to believe was possible, that a man could hold enormous power and choose not to use it in the way that enormous power is expected to be used, that the logic of holy war did not have to produce the outcome that 1099 had produced, that the quality of a victory could be measured in something other than the body count that followed it. The Crusader chroniclers who wrote about him in the decades after his death were men whose entire worldview was organized around the idea that the Muslim world was the opponent of everything they valued. They had every framework available to them for reducing him to that category. They did not do it. They wrote about his justice, his generosity, the specific quality of his conduct in war, the treatment of prisoners, the honoring of agreements, the manner of Jerusalem. They wrote about him using the vocabulary of their own highest ideals, and they applied that vocabulary to the man who had just defeated them. Because the alternative was to lie about what they had witnessed, and they were not. In this case, willing to do that, Dante, writing in the early 14th century, placed Saladin in limbo, not in hell, not among the enemies of the faith who suffered punishment commensurate with their opposition to Christian values, in limbo, alongside Aristotle and Plato and the virtuous pagans who had lived with integrity and whose judgment history found difficult to reduce to condemnation. Dante placed him there without extended explanation, as if the placement was self-evident, as if any reader who knew who Saladin was would understand immediately why he belonged in that company. Walter Scott, writing his novel The Talisman in 1825, made Saladin a central character and presented him as the embodiment of a kind of honor that the story's English readers could recognize, even across the distance of religion and culture and 6 centuries of history. Scott was writing for an audience that had no particular reason to be generous to the memory of the man who had taken Jerusalem from the Crusaders. He was generous anyway, because the evidence of the historical record did not support the alternate with, across centuries, many of the people whose worlds had fought him found ways to admire him, to set him apart from the ordinary enemies of holy war, to reach for him when they wanted to say something about the possibility of power exercised with restraint. The reason his name became available for that reaching across 8 centuries and across the cultural divide between his world and the world that fought him is that what he did at Jerusalem in October of 1187 was genuinely unusual. It was not inevitable. That is the point. It was not the natural outcome of his religious tradition or his political position or the logic of the moment. The natural outcome of his religious tradition and his political position and the logic of the moment was 1099, answered with 1099. That was what the world expected. That was what the world had been preparing for since Jerusalem fell. The settling of an 88-year account in the only currency that Holy War had ever paid in. He declined to pay in that currency. Not because he lacked it. He had it. He was a man of his era, formed by its values and its violences, and its specific understanding of what war required and what God wanted. He had made hard decisions throughout his career, and he would make more of them. He was not a man of simple purity who had somehow avoided the compromises that power demands. He was a commander who had spent 15 years doing exactly what the taking of Jerusalem required. And then he was at the gate. And he had the power. And he made a different choice. Restraint from a position of weakness is not restraint. It is the only available option. What he demonstrated at Jerusalem was something else entirely. Restraint from a position of complete dominance, in a moment designed by history to demand its opposite, is the hardest form of strength there is. He understood that the way you take something is part of what you are taking. He understood that some victories, won the wrong way, become their own defeat. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his entire life learning what power actually costs and what it actually produces, that the memory of how you won matters as much as whether you won. The gates that had been open on that October morning in 1187 were still the gates of Jerusalem. The city behind them was still the city, and the man who had walked through them had made the walking itself the thing that lasted. He took the city and refused the revenge. He was not remembered simply because he conquered Jerusalem. He was remembered because in an age built for holy revenge, he made restraint look like power, and the world, including the world that had fought him, could not forget the way he walked.